Amber, are you ready?
Yep.
Okay, so welcome everyone to Amber's Capstone Defense. Just a few ground rules how we're going to go today. So Amber's going to present for 25 minutes. Then we're going to run through. Terry is her advisor. He's going to have first crack at questions, followed by Alex, her second reader, and then I might have a question as well, given the topic. And then we're going to open it up to the audience if anyone else has questions at that time. Then what happens is we take everyone and move you to a separate Zoom room while Alex, Terry, and I discuss what we just heard and learned about. And then we'll come back and we'll see where we go from there. So Amber, are you ready to go?
I am.
All right. Do you want to share your screen and start us off? Thank you.
Okay. Can somebody confirm that they're able to see this?
Yes.
Perfect. Okay. So hello and welcome everyone. I would like to thank you for taking the time to join me this morning. This project has been in my head in some way or another since 2019, and I'm so excited to share it with you today. My research was about demonstrating value. I was interested in understanding how public relations practitioners could better measure the impact of their work. And with that, let's jump in. So our agenda for today includes 4 key areas: the need, the process, findings, and the takeaways. Given that Terry, Alex, and Dave, you have all read my quite detailed paper, I'm going to take you on a high-level journey today through my research, spend a little bit of time talking about what it all means. So we'll start with the need for this research. PR is a business function, and yet measurement and evaluation remains one of the top issues for PR practitioners globally. There are numerous reasons for this, including that practitioners often focus on vanity metrics, how many people saw a post, how many media stories were picked up, but that doesn't tell us anything about what audiences did with the messaging. Specifically, did they take an action or change their mind or behavior? Also, PR gets stuck doing a lot of busy work that doesn't always ladder up to the organization's broader goals. And as you may know, PR is often referred to as an art, not a science, meaning there's a lot of leaning on gut intuition rather than data. And this all matters because it threatens PR's ability to sit in the dominant coalition, contribute to decision-making, and be seen as a value add rather than just a cost center. I conducted an extensive literature review for this research that included the excellence theory, which suggests that PR should help the organization solve problems and achieve goals for both the organization and its stakeholders through developing long-term, mutually beneficial relationships. I highlighted that while there is a tendency to use the terms stakeholders, audiences, and publics interchangeably, there are important differences between the three, namely that stakeholders are connected to organizations, audiences to messages, and publics to issues. A note here that because of how these terms are used, I used the term audience exclusively throughout my data collection to avoid any confusion. Two-way symmetrical communication is the idea fundamental to PR that relationships require both talking and listening, and therefore research and dialogue should be used to bring about symbiotic changes in the ideas, attitudes, and behaviors of both organizations and publics. And environmental scanning and benchmarking. Because organizations don't exist independently, it's important for PR to understand factors that may influence how communications are received and how their work compares to that of others. A large part of my literature review was dedicated to measurement and evaluation, M&E, and here I looked at different aspects, including current state, how there are inconsistent approaches in use, partially due to a lack of guiding theory, but a recognition that connecting to business goals is important. Principles and frameworks, so the Barcelona Principles and Amex Integrated Evaluation Framework are just 2 that provide guidance for measuring. Controversy, including substitution fallacies, ineffective methods such as add value equivalencies, using business language such as return on investment, and just making up metrics. And finally, best practices, including that measurement and evaluation should happen before, during, and after a campaign, and should absolutely use data. So next we'll jump into the process. My research problem was how and to what extent can PR practitioners better measure the impact of their work? I wanted to look at current practices employed by PR practitioners, existing barriers and gaps they're facing, and recommendations from C-suite communicators and communications experts on how practitioners could start measuring if they're not already doing so. My research questions were, how and to what extent do PR practitioners know they are connecting with their audiences, and what evidence do they have to show they're doing it? What role do measurement and evaluation play in the formation of PR practitioners' efforts? How and to what extent do PR practitioners measure and evaluate their work? And how can PR practitioners who are not currently engaging in measurement and evaluation begin measuring their efforts? To answer these questions in my research problem, I conducted a literature review, which I've just outlined, a survey that was open to all Canadian PR practitioners, where I received 104 complete responses and 31 in-depth interviews, 14 with communications experts, 13 with C-suite communicators, and 4 with non-C-suite communicators. And a note here that because of time today, I will not be including insights from non-C-suite communicators. So survey respondents held a range of positions, including manager, director, officer, up to VP and CCO. Worked in a diverse group of sectors. Healthcare and government are 2 areas I work in, which explains the representation here, as this was shared through my network. And the majority worked in the public sector, which has been an understudied area and led to some interesting findings, which I'll get to shortly. You can see from the dark pink in this chart that the majority of respondents were on a team of just 2 to 10 people, but there was a more even split when asked how many people work in PR across their organization. We had a range of experience represented by respondents, with the majority having been in the field more than 10 years. And finally, respondents were asked if they have a budget for measurement and evaluation. And as you can see here, the majority either said no or they didn't know, which indicated that they did not. But we did have some representation of higher numbers. You can see 5% had over $100,000. Only demographic information collected about the communications experts I interviewed was location. C-suite communicators were seasoned professionals from the US, Canada, and Europe. They worked in a variety of sectors, mainly private, but we did have some public representation from education and healthcare, no government though. And finally, while the majority said either they did not have measurement and evaluation budgets or they were specific to individual clients in agency settings, for example, those who did have one said it ranged from $85,000 to $4 million. So we had quite a range. Okay, so now the exciting part, we're going to move into the findings. So as you'll recall, my first research question was about audiences. Here's what I heard. First, respondents collect various types of information about their audiences. 68% demographic, just under half behavioral and media consumption habits, a quarter psychographic, but a fifth said either they don't collect any information about their audiences or they don't know if they do. How they gather that information included primary research, secondary research, media insight software or tools. But I want to highlight here that the second highest answer at almost 60% said they use assumptions to understand who they're talking to. Survey respondents were asked if they had established processes to listen to their audience. The majority said yes, but almost 40% said no. I ran a series of correlations in this research looking for relationships between different variables. And in this one, I looked at whether there was a relationship between whether respondents listen to their audiences and the sector they work in, public, private, or not-for-profit. And while the correlations seen here are weak, there was a positive correlation between those who work in the private sector and listen to their audiences and those who work in the not-for-profit sector and don't. Finally, respondents were asked how they confirmed their efforts reach target audiences. Well, the top answer was social listening. The second at 40% was that they just assume. Then we had survey, web social analytics, and 13% who said they don't confirm at all. So what does all of this tell us? First, that there is an opportunity to better understand audiences. If we go back to the idea that PR is meant to help organizations operate in a way that is mutually beneficial for both the organization and its audiences, the findings here indicate a missed opportunity for PR practitioners to understand how to do that. Demographic information is great as a first step, but in the pandemic, it was the psychographic information, what people thought, believed, who they trusted, that led to better targeted communication around safety precautions, for example. So not having detailed information about who you're talking to immediately limits your ability to connect with them in places and ways that make sense for them. Second, PR is about two-way symmetrical communication. It's about forming relationships which can't be one-sided. For so long, PR has been accused of just blasting out information without taking the time to connect with the people it's trying to reach. And we saw that here too. 42% of respondents said they either don't listen or don't know if they listen to their audiences. 40% assume their tactics are working. 13% said they don't confirm at all. But we know that listening to audiences has a range of benefits, including improved business operations, reduced employee turnover, reduced risk of crisis, and more. And listening doesn't have to take a lot of work, can be as simple as asking questions to people in your organization or looking at the comments coming in on social and through emails. Without listening to audiences, practitioners aren't able to form relationships, which means the work they're doing is not excellent PR. It's just sending out stuff and hoping something sticks. My second research question was about measurement and evaluation in the formation of PR practitioners' efforts. Survey respondents were asked if there's an expectation in their organization for measurable communications objectives. 63% said yes, almost a third said no. And I ran a correlation between that and what sector they worked in. People who work in private sector were more likely to say there was an expectation for measurable objectives, those in the public sector to say there was not. Respondents were then asked to identify how often their recent objectives were measurable. We had a range, with the most common answer being sometimes. And I ran another correlation here between expectation for measurable objectives and how often objectives were measurable. And when there was an expectation, respondents were more likely to say their objectives were measurable most of the time. When there was no expectation, they were most likely to say their objectives were never measurable. Survey respondents were asked to share an objective from a recent communications plan. 56 out of the 104 submitted one, and out of those, only 12% fit the description of a SMART objective. Most had no measurable element, while some had a measurable element but no time frame. The objectives were coded on whether they were outputs, outtakes, outcomes, or impacts. Almost half were outtakes, mostly focused on generating awareness. Only a fifth were tied to a specific outcome, and just 2 out of the 56 focused on business impact. Respondents were also asked to select all areas their recent objectives had focused on. The light pink ones at the bottom are output, so what the PR team did. The green and the highest responses are outtakes, short-term metrics about the audience's responses or reactions, including awareness. The pink above the green is related to outcomes, so measurable effects on the audience. And the dark pink at the top, the lowest numbers, are impact, so ultimate benefit to the organization. From these results, we get the following insights. 1, PR efforts can't be measured if there are no measurable objectives. If you don't have a goal set that includes a metric, it will be impossible to determine that you've reached it. For example, having a goal of generating awareness means nothing if you don't define it, including what success will look like. Awareness by who, through what vehicle, how are you measuring where you started and where you ended up. Second, PR is a business function supporting business goals. Objectives should be about pushing the business forward in some way. Survey results showed a bigger focus on the doing things and immediate response, awareness, engagement, web traffic, media pickup, rather than impacting the organization in a significant way through things like lead generation, reputation, or behavior change. My third research question was about measurement and evaluation. Survey respondents were asked if they measure and evaluate their work. 71% said yes, 26% said no, 3% did not know. I ran another correlation here. Those who work in the private sector were most likely to say they measured, while those in the public sector to say they did not. Those who measure were asked at what points they measure. Almost all said once the campaign is complete. 70% said during the campaign. Fewer than half said before the campaign begins. Those who don't measure were asked why not. We had a range of answers, including that they measure sometimes, but inconsistently. There's no expectation for it to happen. They don't have the time, the right tools, budget, or knowledge. I ran another correlation to look at the relationship between organizational expectation for measurable objectives and whether respondents measure. Respondents who said there was an organizational expectation were most likely to measure. Those who said there was no expectation were most likely not to. Survey respondents were asked how effective they believe their work to be based on the use of measurable objectives. And there were a range of answers, but the most common was moderately effective, followed by very, followed by a tie, both slightly effective and we don't use measurable comms objectives. I ran a correlation to see if there were relationships between how people answered the question of whether they measure and how effective they believe their efforts to be. Those who said they measure were most likely to say their efforts were very effective, but surprisingly, there was a correlation between those who said they don't measure, but said their efforts were moderately effective. Further analysis found that 15 people who said their efforts were moderately effective answered earlier in the survey that they don't measure, indicating a use of gut instinct rather than data to identify success. Insights for this research question include that there is an inconsistent approach to measuring PR efforts. Businesses run on numbers, and yet almost a third of survey respondents said they don't measure at all. Of those who do measure, fewer than half do any measurement before they start their campaign, suggesting their work is done based on instinct or assumptions rather than insights as to what will be successful. And correlations found that those in the private sector were more likely to measure, as were those where there were organizational expectations for measurement. Second, there's a major opportunity to determine improved effectiveness. While we saw many respondents indicate they think their efforts are effective, we also had some answer that they thought they were, despite indicating themselves earlier in the survey that they don't actually measure. Taking a more scientific approach to back that up with data could help practitioners better compare results across campaigns and the industry, increase their autonomy, and use insights to, most importantly, keep improving. My final research question was forward-looking. How could one start a measurement practice if not already measuring? C-suite communicators and communications experts were asked to provide recommendations for how practitioners could begin measuring their work. The top recommendations were to start small and use what's available, use free or inexpensive resources and tools, and connect to broader organizational goals. Both groups also suggested that measuring at all three stages, before, during, and after campaigns, was important, that there should be some expectation to spend money, and then C-suite communicators talked about the importance of building data literacy on the team. Survey respondents were asked what resources or support would help them better measure and evaluate their work. Top answer was a guide or framework. The second, access to measurement and evaluation tools, then more money and a dedicated person on the team. So what do we learn from this? First, begin simply, simply begin. One theme that came up in a lot of the interviews I conducted was that practitioners may be fearful of starting to measure. They don't know how to do it, they're scared of what the data may show, and so on. But C-suite communicators and comms experts had countless recommendations for how to just start. They suggested looking at data on existing communications channels and from other departments in the organization, adding a quality metric to volume coverage, so rather than just how many media stories, adding headline mentions, message pull-through, etc. They also suggested running A/B tests, talking to people to inform campaigns, and most importantly, perhaps making sure they could answer the question, so what, by tying PR campaigns back to business goals. Second takeaway here is that practitioners want a guide for how to do this. Now, I'll note there are many existing guides, so it could be argued that it will take a lot more than this for them to start measuring. What we saw in the survey, for example, is that an organizational expectation to measure is likely a big influence in the decision to do so, but it did highlight a willingness to learn and perhaps begin. And with that, let's head into the takeaways. So we're going to start with future research. Throughout the survey, there were indications that those most likely to measure worked in the private sector and or were expected to do so. There's an opportunity to understand what the catalyst is to adopt a measurement mindset and show a direct connection between PR activities and business outcomes or impact. One interviewee told me that they had never measured until they had a former accountant join their organization as the new CEO. And because they were expecting numbers, this interviewee had to step up their game, and it changed the trajectory of their career. Second, given that we saw a connection between organizations where there is an expectation for measurement and a measurement practice, it would be interesting to learn more about what goes into those C-suite expectations and what executive teams want the PR function to accomplish. The purpose of this study was to understand how PR practitioners could better measure the impact of their efforts. Surveys saw some positive practices in place, but also many concerning trends. Lack of understanding of the value of listening and talking to audiences, inconsistent or non-existent SMART objective setting, too much focus on outputs and outtakes rather than outcomes and impact, and a lack of measurement culture within organizations. While this sample was not generalizable to the broader population, it did align to the literature and pointed to opportunities for small changes that may have a large impact on PR's effectiveness and ability to prove its value. One major finding was the indication that those who work in the public sector were less likely to measure and evaluate their work than those in the private sector. But in the public sector, there should almost be more of a focus on measurement. With limited capacity and budget, public PR teams don't have resources or time to waste on ineffective tactics. Value for money is critical, as public employees have to be fiscally responsible with taxpayer dollars. And public PR campaigns are often very important to people's lives. They're about things like education, healthcare, policy. So practitioners should measure effectiveness to ensure those messages are getting to the right people at the right time in a way that makes sense for specific audiences, especially since in many public organizations, there may not be a marketing or advertising team. So PR is the main way information is being shared externally. In their guidelines for setting measurable objectives, Anderson et al. Said something that I think sums this all up really well. In many cases, the public relations profession has allowed itself to rely on indeterminate goals in order to avoid being proven a failure. But by doing so, we disallow ourselves demonstrable success. The dictates of business demand more, and public relations will only earn higher esteem and more influence within the business mix if it sets and demonstrates it has achieved measurable objectives clearly aligned with business objectives. I'm going to finish here by showing you the measurement and evaluation guide I created based on this research. This 13-step process is not necessarily meant to be done one step and then the next. The steps can and should often overlap, but it highlights the different elements that go into a successful measurement practice. First, PR practitioners must understand their organization's goals and what's important to their CEO, client, or executive team so that they can identify how PR can reasonably support those, how they want people to think, feel, or act differently. Next, they have to set baselines. They won't be able to determine success if there's nothing to compare to. They then have to define who they're talking to, determine goals for each group, and develop relationships with them. This can obviously take some time, but should include conducting research, talking, and listening. They need to scan the environment to identify potential opportunities and issues, then set objectives that are specific, measurable, achievable, relevant, and time-bound. They can then define proxies for larger objectives. So for example, if one major goal is to improve reputation, that survey isn't likely happening every week. So they should find metrics that indicate movement in the right direction, such as positive media coverage. Practitioners should use all of this earlier research to inform their tactics to reach the right people in the right places with the right messages. They should then look at outtakes during a campaign, those short-term metrics that indicate people are seeing and paying attention to tactics, and make changes as necessary. And to determine achievement or not of broader objectives, practitioners will need to use in-depth research, usually surveys. Finally, after the campaign, it should be a regular practice to report on successes and learnings with the team and clients to ensure continuous improvement. All of this together should lead to a PR practice that's able to use research-driven insights to create campaigns, modify them in flight, and be more efficient and effective through trial and error, continuous learning, and the use of data to prove PR's value to the organization. And with that, I will open it up for questions.
Thank you, Amber. Dr. Flynn, over to you.
Well, thank you very much. I feel like I've been in a Lamborghini for the last 25 minutes. Lots of data, lots of insights. First of all, congratulations on your completion of the paper and the insights that you've garnered. So, what was your biggest aha moment after getting all this data, talking to these 31 experts, analyzing the 107 different responses? What was the biggest kind of aha finding for you?
The biggest takeaway, honestly, after going through the literature review, there was a lot of work that I was doing to better just define what PR's role is in an organization, as maybe silly as that sounds, but based on the research that exists out there, there's a lot of misunderstanding about, our job is to support culture, our job is to, write stories, our job is to do press releases. But what really came through was this idea of relationships. And I think that's not surprising to you, Terry, Alex, or Dave, but it's not something that you necessarily see in PR practice, or I haven't necessarily seen. And so having the number of people who said that they don't have processes to listen to their audiences, or that they assume what their audiences look like and who they are, I think that was probably the most surprising. This fundamental idea of PR being able to deliver the right messages to the right people at the right time, and that if you don't know who you're talking to, you can't do any of that, because how do you know what the right messages are, and how do you know what the right place is and what the right time is if you don't have a sense of who you're talking to? So I think just seeing some of those numbers being so high in the survey, so like the 40% of people who don't listen to their audiences, 60% who just assume. So I think that was probably the biggest aha moment, and provided one of the biggest learnings about, here's a really easy thing that you can start doing to immediately improve your practice.
Well, we know what happens when you assume, right? And so if that happens throughout government, there just doesn't seem to be, there's this dichotomy between private sector expectation for measurement and public sector no expectation. Although I put a caveat, because I think during COVID we saw certain governments, and I'm thinking mostly about Health Canada, measure behavioral change with Canadians, but that wasn't driven by communications. It was driven by health promotion experts, right? So why isn't there a culture in government? You and I talked about this as we were going through this notion of value for money, right? If especially now when governments are looking at cutbacks, why isn't there a mindset for measurement within government communications?
That's a really good question. And I think there are probably multiple answers for this. But one of the things that came through in the interviews when I was talking to folks was this idea that PR hasn't necessarily been held to account in the same way that others in the executive team or in a business mix have been in previous years. Somebody said that they kind of fly under the radar. And if there isn't this organizational expectation for that to happen, it's likely that folks aren't going to do it themselves, because it's, I mean, for a lot of people, it can be scary to be held to account and, you know, to try to hit numbers. But I think in public sector, the goals are not necessarily always as cut and dry as in private sector. So in private sector, there is a big focus on, you know, the bottom line and cost efficiency and making sure it's maximum revenue. And in public sector, when you're talking about things like, you know, making sure people know to get vaccinated, or how to engage in physical activity, or how to quit smoking if they want. These things can be more difficult to measure, and maybe the data isn't as readily available. And so PR maybe is a bit more hands-off, like it's too hard for us to do. We know that there are ways that you can go about measuring how people feel about things and their awareness, but it does take some work. And so I think it's kind of this like lack of organizational expectation, and also these goals that may seem more difficult to assign value to, are two of the reasons why that's not happening.
I'll save a couple questions for the next round.
Alex, Dr. Sevigny, you're up.
Great, thanks. Congratulations on a really good piece of research. I enjoyed reading it. It was well written and it was well argued. And the data were pretty telling in it. They align with a lot of what I experience when I speak to people about measurement. And that's that, you know, the vast majority are still intuition driven, right? Or instinct driven, if you will. And when you talk about a culture of measurement, I think that's probably key, because in the end, if you've always been intuition driven and you've you know, grown up in a culture where people rely on their intuitions and that's prized, and we celebrate people as, you know, kind of gurus or problem solvers or crisis managers because they can kind of magically resolve situations through their intuition driven reasoning. It's going to be hard to convert that culture to a data driven culture, which is something I've kind of looked at for a long time. So, you know, how do we, your data suggests that we can't put intuition behind, nor should we, because it's a human practice, right? About human relationships. So how do intuition and data come together to make to have enhanced decision making?
It's a great question. And one of the things that I think is really important about this is, like, intuition is important, and a good measurement practice requires that somebody is able to be strategic and also be creative in how they look at data and what they're measuring. And I think that part of it always requires that human beings, if you're professionals, are able to ask the right questions. I think, you know, measurement evaluation is meant to be a learning opportunity. It's meant to enhance the work that you're already doing. So if you're thinking about doing something, it's just trying to figure out and maybe being more creative about how you go about doing it to assign some sort of value to it. And I'll just provide one example that I thought was really interesting. I think part of it is just understanding examples and knowing what others have done. But one of the interviewees I spoke with talked about how they ran this safety campaign in an organization, and it was to reduce specific types of accidents. And after the campaign was run, they went and they asked staff in the organization what kinds of activities or injuries they're paying more attention to preventing since seeing the information in this campaign. And then with that information, they went to HR and they asked what kinds of injuries had been reduced since the campaign launched. And there was this direct correlation between what people said that they were paying more attention to and what actually happened. And so they were able to provide an exact return on investment based on knowing how much it would cost the organization to pay sick leave and have people off and all that kind of stuff. But it's that when I heard that, I was like, it makes a lot of sense that this is something that you would do, but it requires a person to think this is the goal that we're trying to achieve, and this is what it would look like if we were successful, and here's how we're going to measure that at the end. So it really requires the creativity to get to that point, which is intuition based and also just based on, you know, research and learning at the same time, and then to use the numbers. So I think it's about opening yourself up to the possibility that there's more to learn, and maybe you don't know everything, which is kind of freeing and also scary at the same time, I know, but with the ultimate goal of enhancing your practice.
Yeah, I think you're right. To me, the real shift towards data-driven practice will happen when we shift away from intuition strategy development towards experiment-driven strategy development. And you see it in the corporate sector, as you said, particularly the American corporate sector, and in politics. It started with Obama, right? Who was the first to run a campaign that they called them EIPs, experiment informed programs, right? So basically, instead of saying, here's a business objective that's aligned with corporate strategy, and we're going to evaluate how it turned out on a set of metrics, they actually set out, they put everything out as a hypothesis, right? So they'd say, okay, we're going to put Obama out in a suit, like a business suit or a track suit at this outdoors meeting, and see what happens, right? So instead of and they didn't do it for every single decision, obviously, right? But for a number of key ones, which would help them shape the brand. And you know, so moving people, and that's what AMEC would like too, right? AMEC would like to see the practice move from you know, this kind of experience and intuition driven campaign design to experiment informed a campaign design, right? So to me, I guess my question is, what sense did you get from the data and from your interviews in particular, of people's understanding of what it means to actually use data? Because when I read your paper, it was interesting. I got the sense that people see data as goalposts, if I were to use a metaphor, or they see data as you know, something to prove alignment, right? But they don't see data as something that's actually part of the practice. And to do what AMEC, for example, would like, it has to be part. You have to think like a researcher, right? To do effective PR. So I don't know, what was your sense? Because I'm interested.
Yeah, I think that's the communications experts, and I think we know this, that the theory behind measurement and evaluation, behind PR in a lot of aspects, and what the practice looks like are not always aligned. It can be a little bit easier to say you do this thing, but then when you're actually talking to people, and I found it really interesting because as I had this kind of like non-C-suite communicator group that I was talking to, they weren't at this high level, so they were answering things about like the work that they were doing wasn't as tied to or specific that we're working towards these outcomes. For them, there was a lot of, we use data on a day-to-day basis to drive decisions about how we use actual platforms. So they said, you know, if we don't have information, like they were like, we know that the research says that we're not supposed to look at outtakes or outputs, but they were like, if we can't see what's immediately resonating with people, then we don't know how to kind of drive the rest of the stuff that we're doing. So it was interesting because I got this sense that data was in use a lot by these folks, and a note that most of them were kind of like in charge or working in research or listening data centers in their organizations, including like at places like Southwest Airlines, which we know uses this a lot. But then the C-suite communicators, it was more that some of the data that they were using was being driven to connect to the outcomes. But in the survey, I don't think that it came through that this was something that was in use a lot. And I think the sense that I have is that it really is like a paradigm shift for folks to move into using data if they're not doing it, because and I think it's important to also say it's not necessarily just having access to data, because I've, attended many conferences in the recent past about measurement evaluation, and it's data is one thing, but it's like the analysis and the synthesis of data that is going to actually give you the insight. So it's, the folks who are like, we have this many impressions on Twitter and this is what we can see, it's improving over time. But what does it mean, and what is the context, and all that kind of stuff has to be done as well. So I think it's a multi-step paradigm shift also, is like getting access to data, understanding what the right data is, but then also knowing strategically how to use that data to give you insights that you can actually work with. So I think the sense that I got is we're quite a ways away from that happening consistently. And certainly, I mean, some of the places that I spoke to, private sector in the US, are doing this because their, bottom line depends on it. But other places, I think we're quite far away from that being a regular practice, unfortunately.
Yeah, no, I hear you. Yeah, I have a couple more questions, but I'll spare them for the next round.
All right, thank you, Alex. I'm going to take one question, but first I'm going to say this is a brilliant piece of work. The literature review was amazing, so well done. It was also very frustrating to read because in the 90s I did a similar study for PR Week magazine. In the 2000s, Dr. Flynn and I did a similar study for CPRS. Every time I read the word assumptions and gut instinct, I groaned and had to stop reading and come back to it later. There's been some shift. So let me say this, your results show some sunlight starting to peek through, that some people have actually started to incorporate data into, have had that paradigm shift, as you said. And the US, I think, is way ahead of Canada when it comes to this, in terms of, even just looking at your experts, who did you find to talk to? They were Americans, not Canadians. So you say that PR is a business function. You say in your paper that a lot of public relations practitioners have a data literacy, or they perceive themselves as having a data literacy issue. I'm also thinking it's a bit of a lack of role literacy. I don't know if necessarily people see themselves in a business function that has to show smart has to show that they've done things right. So I appreciated what you put together in terms of here's your steps. But as you said, there's other programs out there that have created, like AMEC has steps, SMART has steps. How do we move, and maybe you can't answer this, but in your view, how do we champion people to have that role literacy, to understand the need that this is a business function? Because they'll tell you, yes, we need research, but what they mean is, I'm going to use my gut instinct as my research. To move people along, it's a bit of a chicken and the egg. Do you need to understand research in order to become better as a business person? Or do you need to be better as a business person to understand that you need research? So, IPR has been a champion of this. MCM has been a champion of this. I look at our associations, I don't want to belittle too much associations, but, one in Canada possibly uses vanity metrics as a way to measure this category. So who champions this? How do we move to this next step of people understanding that their role is a business function?
Yeah, one of the things that came through quite clearly in the interviews was that education is a really big miss for this right now, and that when people are going to school to study public relations, that there isn't enough of a focus on what the actual goal of PR is, and there's too much of a focus on like the creative side of it. And Terry, you and I have talked about this a lot, but this idea that people who go into PR are writers, they're creatives, they like making videos, and they don't like numbers, and there's almost this fear of numbers. So building the like data aspect into programs is really important, and the MCM program obviously does that, which is really important and highlights helps people feel more comfortable about being around them when that might not be something that's normally in their practice. But I think we need to highlight this stuff more. I've been to several conferences recently that are specifically about measurement and evaluation, and the only people who go to those conferences are people who measure and evaluate their work. Like, they already understand.
Yes.
So it's kind of a wasted opportunity, right? Like, to know about that. So I think it really has to start at the education level, but I wish that there could be some sort of like a campaign, can we PR the PR, right? And like do some sort of campaign about the importance of doing this. The people I talked to said, as soon as you start using data, you're going to increase your credibility.
Yeah.
People are going to take you more seriously. Most importantly, you're going to be able to understand what's working and what's not working. There's a huge issue in PR about imposter syndrome and people thinking that they're going to get called out. If you're not using data, that's a real concern because people can question your intuition, but data is much more difficult to argue with. So I think it's almost this like, maybe associations can help with this. Maybe it's better profiling of people who are actually doing really great work in PR and have risen into different places as a result of the data that they're using. Maybe it's more kind of, you know, boot camp, masterclass kind of things where people are able to understand how to start doing it, and we kind of champion it as a profession. I don't know that there's any one answer, and I don't know, because I know these things have happened as well before. Like AMEC has obviously done a lot of work in this area, and still we don't have the uptake that we would like to have. So I'm not sure what the answer is, but I think there are a lot of things that we could look at doing.
Okay, thank you, Amber. Dr. Flynn, you have another question?
Yep. So I'll be short because we've got only 20 minutes left. So what are you going to do with this? Right. This is a great study, brilliant research, great findings. How do you begin the process of changing the mindset?
So I've applied to present at a couple of conferences next year, and there are a couple more that I will apply to as well. One of the other things that I think is really a potential opportunity. So there's quite a growing community. There is a network of folks on like places like LinkedIn who talk about public relations on a regular basis and measurement and evaluation. I now follow many people, thanks to my interviews and this research, who talk about this on a regular basis. So one of the areas that I really want to start focusing on is sharing some of the research and the learnings and the ratings related to this through those kinds of platforms. And then I think anybody in this room probably who has spoken to me over the last year knows that I talk about this a lot. And this is something that I personally champion. So I'll look for more opportunities to do that. I've also supported IABC's like Ovation awards. I think there's a lot of opportunities for us to continue this conversation. So personally, it's presenting and talking about it through my own networks, maybe looking at publishing too. We'll see.
Is that it, Dr. Flynn? Anything else? All right, Dr. Sevigny?
Yeah, on that note, it's definitely something you should get the word out about, because we really need to spread the good word about measurement and effective measurement, because there's a lot of ineffective measurement that wastes a lot of people's time too, right? Not when Dave does it, of course. But or for that matter, when professional market researchers do it, they tend to do a pretty good job. But when people do it in-house, they tend to botch it. And it costs a lot of time. So one of the things that I think, and I kind of saw it in your paper, is we think about measurement as a justificatory practice, right? So, and that always kind of goes to the bottom line, right? Which is, how are we spending money effectively? So ROI. But I think there's a very strong case to be made for PRs and communications more broadly, contribution to the top line, right? Which is business development, sales, et cetera, and whatever that means for different organizations in the private, not-for-profit or government sector, right? And you can work that out for things like, smoking cessation campaigns or adoption of the Canada Food Guide and stuff like that. It just requires a little bit of thought, right? So, I guess my question is, how do we get people out of the mindset, that sort of defensive mindset, that siege mindset, that we're a cost center, and we, we have to justify our cost, which is that bottom line argument, toward the much more valuable and productive, top line argument?
It's a great question. And I think what it comes down to is getting agreement on the definition of success. And that came through in some of the interviews that I was talking to, when I was talking to folks, that they said, so one of the experts talked about a champagne moment. Like if you achieved what was successful and your CEO walked into your office a year from now, like what would you be celebrating? And I think that there can be some fear in doing this, but this idea of like the first 2 steps of the guide that I put together, which is, what is your organization trying to achieve and what is PR reasonably able to do to support that? And if you can get agreement from the CEO and the executive team on what that looks like, it doesn't just have to be, sales were increased X%. It can be that we were able to create this space, because a lot of people are not looking for your product or necessarily interested in what you're offering, but you're trying to make sure that your organization or what you're saying is top of mind when they're going into a state where they're looking for that information. So measuring awareness might be the thing that your organization is looking for. It's just a matter of getting agreement that is what you're defining success as, and then making sure that your metrics are able to show that there was, we were here and then we increased to here. And that is success, right? It doesn't have to be tied to the bottom line. It can be these top line things. And there is research that's shown that PR can be more successful than like marketing and advertising in some of these areas. We just happen to be very bad at showing our work that we are successful in doing that. So I don't think that that's out of the question, but it is, again, it goes back to that like creativity and strategic thinking about what you're actually trying to achieve, and then making sure that everybody is aligned with that.
Yeah, it's a good answer. I mean, I agree with you. And so now the question is to go out and do it. So you should do that. You should go out and give speeches and workshops and raise awareness of this stuff, and work on developing that alignment, because I think for me, what's really exciting about research like what you've done is the next phase, right? It's working on so what does a metric look like, right? Because if you look at other fields, they have kind of generally accepted, there's like a whole suite of metrics that people understand to create value, and then you pick from them to create a jigsaw puzzle, or to suit the jigsaw puzzle of your organization's strategic objectives, right? So, no, really good work, and you should be, congratulations on this work.
Thank you.
Thank you, Dr. Sevigny. We're running a little short on time, but I am going to say, if there's anyone in the audience who has a burning question they want to ask, please raise your hand. And that's as long as I'm going to give everyone. So we're around. I'm sure Amber is around afterwards if anyone has any questions, and you know how to reach out to her if you're on this call.
Well, if you stay in the room, I'm putting you all in the room, so you can have a conversation with her there.
Exactly. Are you doing that now, Terry?
Yep.
Okay. So everyone, you're going to move to a separate room. You have to accept to move to the room, so please do so. And then we will call you back, and you have to accept to come back to the room. So please do so then as well.